Hello everyone, welcome to this week's Mathcast podcast. Today we are joined by a creative and performing arts scholar and a Math Leap student. Today we are joined by Chloe DaCosta from Year 8, who will join us to discuss fractions and decimals. Without further ado, let's get started. Okay, so this is a topic that when you've heard the intro, you probably already have some ideas about and some times where you've
agonized over it in math class.
That, or you've just been told to change your answer from a decimal to a fraction or from a fraction to a decimal, right? And today we're going to be discussing some moments when you should write it as a fraction or some moments when you should write it as a decimal and which one comes more intuitive, right? And across this podcast we will be talking about things which are more intuitive or just better, even though when we say better we don't actually mean the right way. I mean, we do mean the right way,
just
but
like preferences.
Yeah, preference. For example, if you were to say 15/2 dollars, you would probably be more likely to say 7.5, right?
Yeah. So, like, in a conversational way, in a day-to-day tone, if you walked up to someone who'd taken money from you, and, like, if they wanted a cookie or something, and you say, you owe me 15/2 dirhams back for that, you wouldn't say that because that sounds weird, let's face it. You'd probably say something more like 7 dirhams and 50 fils because it's just more easy to say. And if someone doesn't have amazing mental math skills, they won't be like, oh, 15/2, oh, that's 7.5. They're not going to make that calculation. They're not going to do that for you. But it'll just be easier to say 7.5.
Yeah, and again, just more intuitive. And, like, it's not that they wouldn't be able to, I think. It's more like maybe they would, but that weird. Connection wouldn't be as clear as just saying 7.5 because, well, money works that way. It doesn't, like, 1/15 dirhams, right? It's just more intuitive and just more easy, I think.
And if you're saying things in terms of a decimal or like as a percentage, which we haven't really brought up in the topic, but I feel like it's still necessary to discuss, because if you're saying like 0.75, you likely wouldn't say that. You'd say something like 75% or 3/4. And this can be used a lot in marketing places. So like if you walk past the store and you see we have 50% off or we have 75% off, it's more common.
And they wouldn't say like multiply by 0.5 and that's your discount. Like, no, it would definitely be 50% off rather than like half off or like just because our brain works better with numbers. I feel like it's something we've gotten used to over the last few years or whatever else, or however long you've known numbers existed, right? And
which hopefully is quite long for those of you listening to this podcast.
And fractions have only like recently been covered in depth maybe, and it's just a new thing, and I feel like we don't really like new things and we find them a lot more like dangerous. I don't know if that's the right word, but like we find them a lot more harder to use and we don't normally intuitively go with them, only when we're like told to, hey, look at this answer, does it make sense as a decimal? Maybe try to change it as a fraction, right? For example, writing 1/16 as a decimal, it would probably make more sense to write it as a fraction, right? Because it's not as neat as maybe like 0.5, where it is actually debatable if you should write it as 0.5 or as a half. It depends on your situation. But I feel like some things, they just come, like, I feel like you would never really have to write 1/32 as a decimal. Like, I can't really think of a time where you would have to do that, just to write it as 1/32.
I mean, unless you have a question that specifically asks you, leave your answer in terms of a fraction. When you've got a decimal answer, then you just have to convert it. So, like, if you're doing a number that, like, if you're doing algebra, and your answer to 5x is equal to 37, then you wouldn't do the calculation and represent it as a decimal. You'd probably do 37/5, because that looks neater, and plus it's a lot more accurate than having to round decimal numbers.
Yeah, I agree, and I feel like it is just easier and just more intuitive to write your answer as a fraction just a lot of the times, because decimals aren't as neat and accurate as a fraction, right? A lot of the times there may be like they're both exactly the same. So for example, a fifth is exactly 0.2. So that you can argue about which one to put on depending on the question. But things like a seventh or just whatever other decimal that like goes on for quite a while or just doesn't have like clean, neat numbers, I feel like it's just way more easy to write them as a fraction. And because it takes less time as well, considering like how many digits you'd have to write for the decimal and how many digits you'd have to write for the fraction. And just it takes some time to getting used to, I guess, just because the fractions are a little bit counterintuitive when you first like get started.
And I want to bring up another example of the most famous representing something that's simpler than what it is in decimal form, pi. You wouldn't put down 3.14 whatever it is, because that goes on forever, because it's not easy, and also a lot of people, it's not that they won't understand it, but it's not a lot nicer to look at a fraction, so you'd represent it as the pi symbol, because it works easier with our brain. And if someone saw 3.14, they'd be like, okay, maybe that's an answer, but we know that the pi symbol is 100% pi.
Yeah, and even though it's not a fraction because it's an irrational number, but it's a good example when you it's like kind of like the comparison between fractions and decimals, I feel like, because it's more easy to represent it as the fraction, I mean the symbol, sorry, because if someone looks at the symbol pi, they would immediately know it was pi. But if someone looks at 3.1415 and whatever, yeah, right, they wouldn't maybe immediately make the link, right, just as a normal like day-to-day person. And the same goes with fractions. Like if someone were to say a seventh, they would immediately know that that's a seventh of like maybe a pi or something. They would know roughly what that represents. But if someone said 1/7 as a decimal, some people wouldn't immediately make that connection. Me being one of them, I wouldn't immediately make the connection that that's roughly that much, right? I would just look at the number and see it for a number. I wouldn't see it for the amount that it represents.
And also, since we've been talking about pi a lot, if you're using fractions as a conversational thing, you wouldn't say like 0.5 of a pi. You'd probably say half a pi, or 3/4 of a pi, or a fifth of a pi. So if you're doing things like proportion or visualizing things, then it's more common to use fractions, because if you think of a half, you automatically think of the pizzas that people taught you with when you were in like 5th grade. You'd see half of a pizza. So it's easy to make that visual connection and link in your mind, which is why a lot of people prefer using fractions when they're talking in their day-to-day lives.
Again, I feel like it comes back to what we have learned and what we know, like how we know numbers existed, but we also know fractions exist, which is why we need to make that link to when we should use fractions and when we should use numbers, which is sort of what this podcast has been covering. And another thing, so far we've talked about mostly day-to-day life, but we want to discuss more about calculations, right? Or when you're in a math lesson, which one you should like use to do your calculations. So if you have 2.5, would you rather do that times whatever, or would you rather do 5/2 as a multiplication? So let's talk about that.
So in terms of the 4 operations that are mainly done, so adding, subtracting, multiplying, and dividing, multiplying fractions is normally easier because it's not dealing with much, and it's a lot easier than saying like you could do 1/3 times a half, and it'll be a lot easier than saying 0.333333 recurring times 0.5.
Yeah, I agree, and I also feel like it's similar to what numbers do, because you just multiply the top and multiply the bottom. Like there's not much to it really. But with decimals, there's a lot more, I guess, math involved, where you have to like either be really good mentally or just do like a long division and then figure out the decimal points and stuff. It's just more.
And we all hate long division, let's mention that.
And long multiplication, just because it takes so long. It's easier to do it with fractions. If you've heard our conversation right now and how upset we were that we have to do long multiplication again. So.
And then adding would be easier with decimals though, because if you're adding fractions and say you have a 1/6 and a 1/3, then you're gonna have to convert it so that it has a common denominator. But a 1/6 and a 1/3 are like really easy. You can see that 2 6s equals to 1/3. But if you have more complex fractions, then it'd be harder to add them because of the exchange and the flipping that you'd have to do of the denominators.
Yeah, just finding common denominator. If it's like a bigger number, it would take more time and it would just have like more effort than just adding them, because adding, it's quite similar again to numbers, what we are already familiar with. I guess it takes us back to this point of it being more intuitive and just better to work with, I guess. Just adding numbers is just more straightforward, I guess. If you were given fractions adding and a decimals adding, I feel like the decimals adding would be the one that, it would be easy. If you had to pick between them right now, ask yourself those questions. If you had to pick between them, I'm pretty sure most people would go for the fraction. Obviously, it depends on the question. If it's like a really easy, go for the decimal.
Yeah.
Obviously, if it was like the same denominator, then fair, go for the for the fraction. But like normally, like 95% of the time, you would go for the for the decimal. Yeah. Subtracting with fractions and decimals.
It's basically the same thing as adding, and yeah, because if you have a common denominator, then it's really easy. So like 3/16 minus 1/16, and boom, 2/16. But if you have like 3/7 minus 2/5, then it's a lot harder because of the conversion again.
Yeah, common denominators.
Yeah.
Right. So that's subtracting, and then we've got dividing, right?
Yeah.
Keep, change, flip.
Keep, change, flip.
I feel like fractions is easier.
Yeah.
Because it depends again on the question. But if you're given a decimal, I feel like 95% of the time, this is just a random number thrown out there. It would just be easier to do as a fraction.
And if you do it as a decimal, I cannot tell you how many questions I've gotten wrong with decimals because I've simply divided them wrong, and I hate those questions so much. But it's easier to do division with fractions because we've been taught this method, keep, change, flip, which has been hammered into our head since we were like 9.
Yeah, and after you keep, change, and flip, you just multiply them normally. So again, it goes back to this multiplication and how fractions are just easier to work with because we already know how numbers work. So we can apply our usage of numbers to the fractions because we just multiply and multiply.
And multiply.
Yeah, multiplication,
Yeah.
Great, right? And yeah, I think that's it. Do you want to add anything else?
I think that's basically it. But I have a question for all of the viewers/listeners out there. In the comments, could you please put your opinions, and if we have changed your prior opinion from fractions to decimals or decimals to fractions,
then just please let us know, right? If you were to keep one of them, only one, you can only have one, fractions or decimals, which one would it be? I'm interested to find out. And thank you so much for watching, and we hope you enjoyed.